Alright, so this is summary one. For summary one, we're doing prologue to chapter two. This time it's only me and Carson. It's only Fred and Carson. I'm Fred. Tyler is absent today because he has a tennis game. Anyways, let's begin.
Start again. Alright, so in the prologue, Thomas King, he starts off as a introduction to the author, essentially a backstory about one of his pasts in his band, but it just summarizes the way he writes and who he is as a person, which is, I don't know, it's a little important, but not necessarily important for the thesis of the book, you could say. And then directly after that, later on, he divulges into the important subjects and talks about how his opinion on history and how books named history have to follow specific criteria to be credible, but he doesn't like following that criteria, so instead he changed the word history from a curious history of Native people to a curious account of Native people, and yet he says that, but still hypocritically he talks about large amounts of history throughout pages and facts on facts as well, which I find a little interesting.
Okay, so I thought this was kind of important because, like, I think you said this, basically we are from this, we are expecting what this author is going to be talking about and how he is going to be talking about these things. Yeah, just keep on.
Yeah, that's what I agree. And then later down, he talks about truth be known, I prefer fiction. I dislike the way facts try to thrust themselves upon me, and that's just going directly back to what I previously stated on how he says he dislikes facts and fiction, and he tries, dislike facts and history, and he tries to stay away from that. And yet later on in the book, he continuously discusses only about facts in some parts of paragraphs, which I find just contradictory. But nonetheless, it captivates the points that he's trying to portray. So, and then next, he, continuing on that, just a little tangent, he even later on exclaims that his book itself, The Inconvenient Indian, is filled with history itself, but the underlying narrative is a series of conversations and arguments. So he's just saying how it's just bottled up emotions and things he'd like to say, but at the same time it's completely chock full of history, which again is contradictory. But forgetting that, the next few pages he just talks about pretty much diction throughout the book, how like Indians and whites and all that is usually pretty derogatory and discriminatory, and it doesn't encompass the entire group. But he later discusses that in this book he's using them in the politest way it can be, as it goes with the flow, and it just makes more sense to use it in that style, which I find interesting. I understand that he can say what he wants as himself. He is a Native American, but just to say every other discriminatory group and claim it's okay, I don't know, it's a little biased. Do you think so?
I think this book is definitely very biased.
Yeah.
Like you said, he is
Native American
a Native American himself, and in some part of his book he is very biased to some author's book. The author is his friend, so it's a very biased book in my opinion, and
it just doesn't have a flow to it as well. Like, I don't find a specific plot following bias, but anyways. And then essentially he just talks about the prejudice Indians have faced as an introduction to chapter 1, Forget Columbus.
Okay. Alright, on to chapter 1, Forget Columbus. To sum it up, this chapter is basically talking about how the whites makes history misleading to justify what they've done, or to make the history look more glorious and not so boring. In the very beginning of the chapter, the author went in to talk about how Columbus, the story, is actually made up and glorified. He was actually not the one who discovered North America, but it was actually by a group of Asians, and they were already like
the Norse,
or the Norse.
Evidence points towards both.
Yep. And also, he talked about how history made up a series of stories that we talked about in the past. Um, they were not chosen by the stories were not chosen by chance, uh, and the stories are mainly about mainly about famous men and celebrated events. Sometimes they throw in a couple exceptional women's every now and then, not out of the need to recognize females,
Out of embarrassment.
eminence, but out of embarrassment.
I found it interesting is that he started talking about Columbus as though he's kind of a taboo figure. It's like, oh, Columbus, all Native Americans talk about that. But yet he goes on the positive side and says the credit towards Columbus is necessary, as history always has to credit people. And if it wasn't Columbus, it just would have been someone else. And it had a low possibility of being the Norse or the Asians. So in the end, it wouldn't matter. And that's why he kept on saying, forget Columbus. That's what I feel like.
Yeah, I feel like that's a better explanation. I'm not really good at summarizing stuff. And then the next point, they talked about the Indian massacre in a little town called Almo, saying that the Indians killed 295 white people, and five of them escaped. So there was actually 300 victims. However, and
This story is essentially.
And then later on, the author starts listing a bunch of massacres that the white did to the Indians,
And vice versa.
and vice versa. And then in the very end of the section, she surprised us with saying that the massacre in Elmo actually did not happen.
And it was all fabricated.
It was all fabricated by the white people.
It's just that being fabricated. The total kill count towards natives on whites to whites on natives is worse for white people.
Then later on, in the next point, the author went on to talk about Pocahontas, the famous story that Disney made, the famous movie that Disney made, where in the movie it was talking about the main character, John Smith, a white male, where he got captured by a group of savages, and ended up getting into a relationship with their princess, Pocahontas. We all know that this story is actually not true, and
Possibility. Yeah.
and the author suggested, and at the end of the section, that if this actually happened, according to historical fact, Smith would have been 27, while Pocahontas would have been 10.
Yeah.
So the chance of this relationship happening is not so likely.
And he said, so here are the facts, and yet when you go down, he says that Pocahontas would have been 10 or about 12, which isn't necessarily a fact when you say maybe. So I find that interesting, but continuing on.
At the end of the chapter, the author gave us an example, which was the Custer's Last Stand. Basically, Custer and 6 or 7 other soldiers went into war with a bunch of Indians. We don't know how the war went, but we had paintings and stuff that suggest that Custer and his army and a bunch of soldiers fought gloriously and died gloriously by killing a bunch of Indians.
Bravely.
Bravely, yeah.
Yeah.
However, these were just paintings. There was no historical facts that they actually died while fighting Indians. He could have been stabbed when he was resting, or some other like pathetic way to die.
The paintings are just guesses on how they died, and in
Yes.
reality, it might have not been the case.
Yes, there is.
It's
There was no camera or
people
anyone
there painting.
Yeah,
It's just glorifying the
It's
white
glorifying
people, killing the natives.
history.
Yeah.
which
Makes them look worse in return.
yes, which which supports her idea that white people are glorifying their history to make
Yeah.
them look better.
Which is the main point in chapter 1. And that's pretty much it.
That's pretty much it for chapter 1.
Yeah. Chapter 2. Chapter 2. Thomas King starts to talk about him and his brother when they were younger. They would often play a game called Cowboy and Indians with the rest of the kids, and they would either dress up as cowboys or as Indians. As they're all Native Americans, it would not matter, as they would always dress up as cowboys, which has some importance as no one would want to be an Indian, except for one of his friends who'd like to dress up as an Indian, and it was a hero called Straight Arrow. It was a popular character from around 1949, and essentially what he was, as he dressed up as a white man in disguise, but whenever danger arose, he would get his golden arrows and bows and hop on a stallion and go fight evildoers, which I feel like the author can connect with, as though when he dresses up as a cowboy, he's hiding the fact that he's Indian as he dresses as a cowboy for reasons unknown, but probably because he's a little hesitant towards his heritage.
Why do you think the author talks about this? What's the purpose of her talking about her childhood and cosplays, Halloweens and stuff?
I feel like he's capitalizing on the fact that he thinks in society people feel as though Indians aren't as important, and he can, I feel, portray this through a little childhood story, which makes it easier to state and is harder to pick apart than just straight up saying that.
I can agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
So that's that. And then later on, he goes straight to the point, and he starts talking about colonists who feel feelings had been hurt could always console themselves with the knowledge that whites who had found their way to North America were part of God's master plan, and Indians who had been here long were not. So it gets pretty intense off the bat. So he's discussing how Indians aren't part of God's plan, and essentially white people are, as they're more important at design to capitalize over Indians. And I feel as though this definitely further suggests the previous point on how Indians aren't necessarily perceived as important to most ethnicities. At least back then they weren't, but later on people find more interest in them, as he states previously, parents finding Indians more interesting, and there's progression with Indians in society. And he starts stating a lot of wars, a lot of Indian conflicts that happened, around 3 pages worth. But yeah, after the statement of all the wars that occurred, or Indian affairs, that's not really necessarily a right word, Indian conflicts, I should say, he starts discussing a sculpture. It's an Indian sculpture. It's Indian, or Native American, riding his horse. And in the beginning, his perception of it is that the horse is, though it's being pushed from behind, that's something where someone is trying to shove the horse and rider over a precipice? Yeah, over a precipice. And he says that most likely it's the soft and gentle hands of civilization. But then later on he discusses that if you look at it a second time, it looks as though the horse is resisting as its front legs are being braced. And he goes into detail on his perception of the statue and connects it as though the fact that Indians are fighting back from American culture, and it's showed through the horse, and that's his perception.
So far, do you agree that whites don't need a diverse populations of Indians, but what they really need is a figure to say that that they're actually treating the Indians pretty equally?
Yeah, I'd say so. In the story at least, I feel like he says that whites don't have a motive to learn about Indian heritage and history, and I can agree with that, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
Wait. And then after that, he starts talking about Indian portrayal in film through a page or two about how they hunted buffalo and all this. And there's 3 types of Indians: the bloodthirsty, the noble and the dying Indian, all portrayed through film,
Yeah.
which I feel is accurate because it's capitalized on Western culture, is in Indian movies and films, and it's actually not their culture by itself.
Yeah.
So it doesn't portray what a true Indian really is.
And
he-
you actually,
yeah,
sorry,
no worries.
and you actually like now you think about it, in movies you often do see those three stereotypes of Indians.
Yeah, it's just something that, I don't know, I guess you could say white people could find the most interesting, because history itself, as he says, is not necessarily interesting. And people often like to change something
Change stuff
to make it
glorify
more
them.
glorify.
Yeah.
Exactly, just like the paintings and the stories. This is all tied into one thing. And now he's talking about the movies as well. Yeah. And then he spends 4 pages talking about stamps and coins and movies, all where Indians were not actually properly portrayed, and rather it's just Western culture twisting their heritage into something more interesting, which I completely agree on. And that's all I have. What about you?
Alright, and for and then like in the last little bit of chapter 2, the author starts the author talks about why Indians aren't casting as doctors, lawyers, baseball players, and holding the author rich assholes. And then she lists off a bunch of roles that Will Smith, a black actor, plays. For example, he plays a fighter pilot, dating coach, superhero, etc. And then he lists off a bunch of native actors, and concluding that none of these people are, or all these minor actors. Then he starts listing off a bunch of native actors and saying that most of these people are only playing minor roles.
As he says that Indians aren't as important as main roles.
Yeah,
or major
I
roles.
think that was his point.
Yeah.
They're saying that there might be a little racism.
And if they are a major role, it's usually portrayed by another ethnicity rather than native itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
And that was pretty much it.
Yeah. I feel as though the author pretty much spends the last 2 chapters in prologue, besides a prologue introducing himself, the last 2 chapters talking about how natives actually are pretty prejudiced, and they're perceived as not an important ethnicity or heritage, especially revolving around white people. So yeah, overall, the book, I feel as though it's pretty well structured, and the author properly portrays his emotion and opinion about it. It's a little biased, but I feel as though that's necessary, and it's a pretty important book talking about Indian prejudice and all the things they have gone through.
I think I can learn a little bit from this book. Like, it's very clear which side
The author's
the
on,
author's on. You know,
but it makes sense.
it makes
Yes.
sense.
Looking back at history. Yeah. And yeah, other than that, I have no questions about the book, and it's
And
good.
this will be the end for summary 1.